Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to give an economics lecture to a crowd that's not made up mostly of economists. It does pose a little bit of a challenge, so I've overworked my slides. There's like 100 of them. There's no way I'll get through them because I wasn't sure of what people's background was going to be in some of these measures and concepts. So, oh yeah, sorry. So in economics, we are very rude and constantly jump in, not just to ask questions, but to make comments as well. I will be more than happy to field any questions as I'm talking because it's most important to me that you understand what I'm saying rather than my getting through every slide. I've already had too many slides, so please stop me if anything's not clear. What I want to talk about tonight is the relationship between specifically income inequality and what's called subjective well-being. So there are many different facets of inequality that are important and interesting and could fill up many lectures, an entire course to try to cover them. So what I want to focus on is income inequality. And then in terms of measures of well-being, traditionally in economics, we use per capita gross domestic product as a measure of economic well-being. But there's been some movement away from that as the singular measure and towards incorporating other measures of well-being, one of which is what's called subjective well-being, which will be the main focus of the talks, like on the outcome side. And so I'm going to go into a few different conceptions of what income inequality are, and then the relationship between income inequality and people's self-reported well-being. So first, before going on, it's important to establish what subjective well-being is. So subjective well-being is really just a self-report of your well-being, and it can cross many different domains. Often it's termed just happiness, but usually the questions that are asked in order to measure it are not just about that. I'm giving you just a few measures that come up in big surveys. So one is the United States General Social Survey, and it uses the question, taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you were very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? That's it. And then we code not too happy as 1, pretty happy as 2, very happy as 3. The World Values Survey, which is administered to something like 190 countries, asks a few thousand people in those countries, in each country each year, to, among other things, report their life satisfaction, and that's done on an explicitly numerical scale. So all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days, where you can answer from 1 to 10. 1 is written in as dissatisfied, 10 is satisfied, and you just pick a number in there. The Gallup World Poll and the Gallup Daily Poll in the United States are the biggest data sets that have a subjective well-being survey in them. It's not just one question, they have many, but one of them is this, what's called Cantrell's Ladder or Best Possible Life Index. So this says, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? So these are some of the measures that are out there. There are many, many more. So Gallup is asking, in the United States alone, 1,000 people a day to fill out, all sorts of different aspects of their lives and attitudes. But this question, among some others, are in there. So it's been shown that subjective well-being measures, like these life satisfaction and general happiness, are correlated with things that we would want them to be correlated with. They're correlated to frequency of smiling, smiling with the eyes, that unfakeable smile, ratings of one's happiness made by their friends, frequent verbal expressions of positive emotions, recent positive changes of circumstances that we would assume would make one happier, say increased income or marriage, sleep quality, happiness of close relatives, and self-reported health. So this is a pretty good measure. Another thing I should mention, which most people don't know, is that if there's a fear of self-reported data. It shouldn't be unique to subjective well-being. For example, the way that we measure unemployment in the United States is a subjective measure. We don't get administrative records and see how many people there are and how many people are working. We call people on a frequent basis and find out whether they have worked in the last 4 weeks and whether they looked for work in the last 4 weeks. So that's a self-reported measure as well. Here, what's kind of a little bit difficult about this measure is that there isn't some sort of objective datum that I can look to corroborate one's subjective well-being. So while I can say, okay, I can go to some sort of administrative record and find out whether this person actually worked or not, there's no such thing I can do for subjective well-being. So there are many more questions of the validity of this type of data than for other self-reports. There are 3 dimensions of subjective well-being that are important to people who study it. These are what's called evaluative, experiential, and eudaimonic subjective well-being. And they have similar determinants, but not quite exactly. Evaluative is most of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, which are the types of questions we already saw. Assessments of life as a whole or particular domains of life. For example, taking things as a whole, how satisfied are you with your family? How satisfied are you with your finances? How satisfied are you with your life, as we saw? Then there's experiential subjective well-being, which is looking more at mood or affect experienced currently or in the recent past. So a big question, or a big kind of slew of questions in the Gallup World Poll are about, did you smile yesterday? Have you felt sad this week? And interestingly, you'll see a positive relationship between income and evaluative subjective well-being throughout the income scale, whereas with experiential subjective well-being, we max out at around $75,000 a year in the United States. So if you've heard that statistic, like money doesn't make you happy beyond $75,000, it does when it comes to evaluative subjective well-being. It does not when it comes to measures like, did you sleep well last week? Did you smile yesterday? Have you felt worried or sad? The last type of measure is what's called eudaimonic subjective well-being, and this is kind of bigger feelings of worthiness, having a sense of purpose or meaning in your life. So very interesting things like, watching more television correlated with higher levels of experiential but not evaluative subjective well-being, having children correlated with lower experiential and evaluative well-being but higher eudaimonic well-being. Just to, again, show you that this tracks other measures of well-being out there, here we're looking at life satisfaction on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we're looking at life expectancy. So each data point is a country. The size of the country's point refers to the population of the country. And what you can see, and you'll be doing this a lot during this talk, looking for trends, is that there is a clear upward trend. So the countries that have higher life expectancy at birth have higher levels of life satisfaction as measured by that best possible life or Cantrell's ladder. You can see here also that that subjective well-being, it's negatively correlated with mental health problems in a country. And interestingly, for some countries, like if we look at the left-hand side, what we're seeing is the correlation between subjective well-being and mental health concerns in that country. So we have Indonesia, UK, Australia, United States going down the left. And you can see, for example, that there isn't that big a correlation for Indonesia. There's a very strong correlation for the United States. On the right, as a point of comparison, we have it's a little bit out of order. The United States and UK are in opposite places in the two. But we're looking at the relationship between, the correlation between income and subjective well-being within those countries. And what's really interesting is you can look at, for example, Indonesia, where income is a much stronger determinant of subjective well-being than is mental health, whereas in the UK, Australia, and the United States, mental health concerns are a much stronger predictor of subjective well-being than is income. Clear how to read that? Because we don't have objective measures of this stuff, right? We are taking people's word for what their level of happiness or life satisfaction is. We're also administering the same survey in many different countries. So a concern might come up like, is there a difference in the way that one country or people in one country or one language interpret the word happy versus life satisfaction? Again, you can see here a strong positive correlation between self-reported life satisfaction in a country and the share of people who say that they're very happy or rather happy in that country. Interestingly, there's some, strong exceptions, like Rwanda down in the bottom right corner. Here's a country where many people say that they're very happy or rather happy, but they're not particularly satisfied with life. So we have some concerns about how to exactly word these things, but for the most part, there's a strong correlation. We have here a scatter plot of countries. On the x-axis, we're measuring their satisfaction with their freedom, their self-perceived freedom. The share that is satisfied is what we have on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have their self-reported life satisfaction. Again, you can see a strong positive correlation there. One reason I brought up already, but that this is an increasingly important measure, and you see a lot more coverage of it in the news, is because there's been in the last 10 years, a lot of disappointment with gross domestic product as a measure of well-being. Gross domestic product was never intended to be a measure of well-being. It was intended to be a measure for how much stuff you're producing in a country, stuff and services. And at some point along the way, it started becoming the gold standard for thinking about the well-being of a country, right? The gross domestic product, there's some interesting, important criticisms of it that Sarkozy, when he was president of France, he commissioned Nobel Prize winners Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen to basically put together all the criticisms that there are of GDP as a measure of well-being. One of the things that they came up with was that it's important to complement it with measures of things like subjective well-being. Other criticisms with it, of course, are things like, you don't measure household production. So if I raise my own children, then that doesn't count it doesn't get added into gross domestic product. But if I hire somebody to take care of my children, that does get added into GDP. There's a whole feminist critique of it because a lot of the stuff that's not measured is traditionally female work. Another criticism of it is that it doesn't take any sort of sustainability into account. So GDP doesn't tell us whether the income generation process, for example, is one that can persist over a long period of time. So if you generate production in a very polluting way, that enters equally as something that's a cleaner energy. So as a result of that, and kind of spearheaded by Bhutan, that about 10 years ago started, or actually longer, 20 years ago started measuring explicitly gross national happiness as a complement to gross domestic product, a lot of countries have been including these types of happiness questions into their national accounts. So for example, Britain has, in its Office for National Statistics, an entire well-being and subjective well-being section. France is doing that. All sorts of countries are getting on board with that, and we have a pretty good understanding of what these are, but a lot of research is being done in real time to understand what these metrics are. Okay, so now to moving closer to the topic of the talk, which is income inequality and subjective well-being. The first work in this whole field, the pioneer in studying subjective well-being in economics, was Dick Easterlin, and he set up what's called the Easterlin paradox. And it's trying to answer this question of whether subjective well-being increases with income. Okay? And it has a very complicated and clearly paradoxical answer. So I want to take you through this before getting to income inequality itself, because it's actually an important piece of why income inequality is interesting. So first, the answer to the question is going to say it depends on how we look at the data. First, if we look at the data, looking at average national subjective well-being, so think of that as average national happiness, and compare across countries that have different measures of economic output, we see the following diagram, a very strong positive relationship, right? It's concave, it sort of flattens out at a certain point, but that's sort of more an optical illusion, because if you rescale the axis, the x-axis, so that you're now looking at what's called a ratio scale, so each tick is now like a doubling of national income, you have a very linear relationship. There's no clear satiation point that it might look like there is in this graph. Is that clear to everyone? So the takeaway from this is there's a strong positive relationship between the average income in a country and the average life satisfaction in that country. And the next way you can look at this same question is to look within a country and to look at the households that have lower as opposed to higher income. So here, if you look at the US in 2016, these are the way that the General Social Survey asks your income is whether you fall into one of these bins, less than 10,000, between 10,000 and 15,000, and so on and so on. And so what you can see is that there is, again, this strong positive relationship as you're going farther to the right, as you're looking at richer households, their subjective well-being is increasing. Same thing holds for China if you look at their World Values Survey measures. This here is looking at many different countries, right? And looking at, for each country, the line corresponds to the increase in subjective well-being as you go from the poorest 20% of the population to the next poorest to the next poorest. So you have 5 categories for each country. So for example, like here, if you look at, oh God, sorry. If you look at the country for which the poorest is the poorest, right? Democratic Republic of Congo, this is looking at the poorest 20% in Democratic Republic of Congo. This is looking at the next poorest 20% in DRC, and so on and so on. So you have 5 data points per country. And the basic thing to take away from this is these lines are pretty much all upward sloping, meaning that for all countries, the poorer people in that country are not as satisfied with their lives as the richer people in those countries. And what's different from country to country is what did I do? Is the exact trajectory. But you can see, this is just kind of taking everything and making an arrow out of it from the last slide. But you can see that these arrows are generally all upward sloping. Questions so far? Okay. Okay, so here again we see, already we saw that if you're looking across countries, there's a positive relationship between subjective well-being and income. If you look within countries, there's a positive relationship. And now what we're going to do is look at average national subjective well-being over time in the same country. So this is Dick Easterlin's kind of updated version of his famous graph, which is that you have GDP in the United States increasing, or GDP per capita increasing steadily from 1972 to 2002, and happiness is basically a flat line. Average happiness is a flat line. So this is the paradox, right? This is the paradox is, if we look across countries, there's a positive relationship. If we look within countries, there's a positive relationship. But if we look over time within the same country, we don't see any relationship, actually, right? And this holds for Japan. This is from 1958 to 1986. They had phenomenal economic growth during that period, a totally flat life satisfaction line. Same thing for UK, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, from 1973 to 2004. So the takeaway from this, the Easterlin paradox, is again, average subjective well-being increases with income in the cross-section, both within and across countries, but not over time. Now, what are some possible explanations for why this might be the case? So 2 that I'm going to explore are going to be relative income concerns. So this is basically saying if income only matters to us insofar as it's greater or lesser than the people around us, then as you make a country generally richer, the income distribution is going to stay more or less the same, and so you're not going to have any change in average happiness. That's what's called the relative income story. Clear? Another story is that as countries are getting richer, there's increasing income inequality, and that increasing income inequality hurts people's subjective well-being. And so even though the effect alone of getting richer as a nation might be improving subjective well-being, that the simultaneous increase in income inequality is going to be decreasing subjective well-being. Again, that's something that we'll be looking at with my research. Other explanations that I won't be looking at in this talk, but equally interesting and valid, one is an adaptation story. So the idea being you get used to a higher level of income, and so you just kind of normalize your happiness back down to that, meaning that there's some sort of set point of subjective well-being around which you move, only from changes. Another one is that the income generation process itself is hurtful to subjective well-being. So for example, if it requires working very long hours, not spending as much time with family and friends, then the fact that you've become richer has been at the expense of some important determinants of subjective well-being. Similarly, if there's an impact on the environment and that's important to our subjective well-being, this is all going to get wrapped up into a kind of stationary level of subjective well-being. And then another issue is that, this is from the naysayers of even looking at this kind of data. Well, who cares? We don't know how to interpret these subjective well-being questions, which I'm totally sensitive to. It is weird. I mean, economists, just to give you an idea, economists do not care for self-reported data at all. We use a preference to understand people's behaviors and motivations and preferences, which is called revealed preference. You never trust what somebody says they like. No one's ever going to say, I'd rather pay for cigarettes and alcohol than put my kid through school. But you see that happen all the time in revealed preferences. So revealed preference says, let's assume something about the way people make decisions, that they're rational, that they're self-interested to some degree, maybe that they have some levels of altruism, and then back out what their preferences must be when we see the way that they make decisions over real bundles. So the move to say, okay, now I'm going to actually measure how well off people think they are by asking them is one that is not taken very well in the economics community. And so they would say that there's a lot of measurement issues with this and that it's kind of like a fool's errand to even try. Okay, so now we're going to go again to these explanations of the Easterlin paradox having to do with the way that we feel about other people's income. So that's really what the basis of a lot of my research is about. So here I'm looking at the relationship between subjective well-being and inequality. So before getting to that, I want to talk a bit about the way that we measure inequality in economics. So the main measure that we use, which you might have heard of, is something called the Gini coefficient. So what the Gini coefficient is doing is it's taking an economy and taking each person in that economy and lining them up from richest to poorest, and then looking at the cumulative share of income that that percentile of the population has. So I'll give you kind of one extreme case first. Up here, we have an economy of 10 people, each of whom has 1 unit of income, okay? So for them, this graph that's looking at fraction of the population from richest to poorest and then cumulative share of income is just a 45-degree line, because basically it's saying the poorest 10% of the population have 10% of the income, 90% of the population has 90% of the income, et cetera. Clear? At the other extreme, we have this, again, 10-person economy where you have 9 people with no income and 1 person with 10 units of income. And this is far from, if I map them out here, it's far from this 45-degree line. It's like this. And in fact, if I had more and more people, it would just become this kind of backwards L. So what the Gini coefficient is doing is looking at the space between the 45-degree line and the actual income distribution. So this income distribution here is one where the poorest person has $1, the second poorest person has $2, and so on and so on. right? And so we see that in this kind of economy, we get a Gini coefficient of 0.3, which is the ratio of this gray space to this triangle. Is it clear how that works? Down here, we get a Gini coefficient that's very similar to the US income Gini coefficient, which is an economy that has 9 people getting $1 and 1 person getting $10. And you end up with a Gini of 0.426, which is very close to the US value of 0.41. Another measure that I'll be talking about is what's called relative income. So relative income is, again, how do I compare to some other person in terms of income? Now, we might talk about there being many different potential comparison groups. I might compare myself to my colleagues. I might compare myself to my family. I might compare myself to people that live in the same city. So we pick some sort of reference group, and then we say, how far away from that average is my income? And we call that thing relative income. Does that make sense? Now, the problem with that is that here, if I look at this distribution, right, this distribution where everybody had the same amount of money, we had 10 people with $1 each, you have the exact same average as you have down here, where you have 1 person with $10 and 9 people with no money. So there's an important metric in there, but it's not the same as this measure of the dispersion of the of the income distribution that something like the Gini coefficient is trying to pick up. So something that might be hard to agree with is that the global Gini coefficient of income has actually been decreasing from 1985 to the present. So we care a lot more about income inequality, or a lot of different inequalities now than we maybe did in the past. For example, the World Bank didn't used to care a great deal about inequality, and they have their mission of eradicating poverty. But recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, they had a shared prosperity world development report, and the entire focus was on inequality, which means that now it's part of all of their analyses that they do. Part of what might be kind of weird about this is that we underappreciate the level of income increase that has happened in big countries in the world like India and China, which I'll show you pictures of. But the other is that this is an inequality of income, not of wealth. Wealth and income are 2 very different measures of financial well-being. Income is a flow measure, so it's sort of like how much money do I make per year? What is my annual salary? Let's say something like that. Whereas wealth is what is the value of the assets that I own, right? So income inequality is not going to capture the fact that that I might own like 10 properties or something like that if my income is only $10,000 a year. I mean, it would be weird if it were 10,000. I would be doing something very wrong with those properties if that were the case. But I hope that distinction is clear. In fact, interesting, I just came here from a World Development Report 2019 talk. It's going to launch in a panel discussion. It's going to launch in 2 weeks about the changing nature of work. And they keep finding, in developing countries especially, you have income inequality going down. And like the stakeholders in the World Development Report, like the German chair, they don't want to hear that. They moved all this emphasis to inequality, and for the World Bank to be saying actually it's decreasing in a lot of places, it's sort of counterproductive for them. But the important thing to keep in mind is that that's income inequality and not wealth inequality. And if you think about the distribution of power, which is really the most important, maybe the most important way to think about inequality, wealth is going to be a much more important indicator than income is. So you'd think that like the political power is held by the people who have high wealth, not necessarily high income. Okay, so to kind of again persuade you that the global Gini of income actually, it's not too surprising that it's downward sloping. This is as long run as we get in economics. So we're looking at per capita GDP from the year 1000 until now. And you can see that the Industrial Revolution takes off in Britain, so they're the first to experience the exponential growth rates that we see. And then you have kind of Japan, Italy, China, and India here. And the important thing to keep in mind here is a place like China or India, they very recently saw these huge increases in their per capita GDP, right? And that increase is going to weigh very largely in the international measurement of inequality. This is one of my favorite visuals from a textbook that I highly urge you all to look at online. This is a free online textbook called CORE, Curriculum Open Access Resources for Economists, put together by a number of economists after the financial crisis in order to address the problem that introductory economics courses and economics curricula are so out of touch with the important issues of the day, with inequality, with the environment, et cetera. Very hard to get movement on this if you had one author. This has 23 authors. And they're top of the line researchers from Oxford, UCL, all over the place, Columbia. And this is one of the first graphs. Actually, that last graph you saw and this are the first two graphs that you see when you quote unquote open this book. It's all online. You could get it for $50 paper copy, but it's all online, waiting for you to look at. All of the data sets that it uses are available to you as well. So it's an amazing resource, amazing resource. So what do we see here? Here we have a three-dimensional graph, which is always hard. We have countries lined up. This is the 1980 global income distribution, and we have countries lined up from poorest to richest on average. And the colors that are going to go throughout here are the colors from 1980. The width of each country corresponds to its population, so you can see China's quite wide. And then here we have some thinner countries that are in the high income category. And in this axis, we have the income, the average income of the poorest 10%, the next poorest 10%, up till the richest 10%. So these are what are called income deciles. So the important thing to see here is its evolution over time. So this is 1980. Here we have 1990. You can see China getting richer on average. And then here we have 2014. China is significantly richer than it was. It's at the levels of something like Brazil in the 80s. And part of this movement alone is responsible for that diminishment of overall income inequality that we're seeing. Another thing that you can see is that the richest people are getting a lot richer, but what's hard to see in this graph is the increase in middle incomes if you look at an international level, even though that's definitely not what we're experiencing within our country and a lot of other countries. So here is a lineup of countries by their inequality. So this also reveals a very interesting difference in measures of income, which is that between market income, which you can think of as like the actual money that you bring in, say on your paycheck or on returns to investments, and then disposable income, which is that same market income once you've accounted for any taxes and transfers. So once you've paid your taxes and once you've gotten any cash benefits or any benefits from the government, you're left with your disposable income. And the reason that this distinction is so important is because many countries have equally high levels of market income inequality, but because of their tax and transfer systems, they're able to have radically different levels of disposable income inequalities, which might be the thing that we care more about. So if you look here, the red is corresponding to the disposable Gini and the disposable income Gini, and then add to that the blue to get the market income Gini. So the fact that the blue is always above the red just means that countries are successfully redistributing income from richer to poorer people. So that's a good thing. And what we can see is South Africa is the most unequal, both in terms of its market income and in terms of its disposable income. And then you have this lineup of countries here. Here's the United States, right? United States' market income Gini is actually not too different from the rest of the world, right? It's actually not particularly high. What is particularly high about it is among industrialized countries, it has the highest level of disposable income inequality, meaning that we have much fewer taxes and transfers than do other countries with similar levels of income. So you can see here, like Sweden is starting out with roughly the same level of market income inequality, but they're able to tax and transfer their way down to a much lower, about half the size of the Gini. This is kind of the same thing, except looking at all of the OECD countries from 2012 to 2014. And again, you can see that like United States is sort of on its own in terms of highly industrialized, high-income countries in terms of its level of post-transfer disposable income inequality. Questions so far? Okay. Another measure of inequality is the percent of total US income going to particular top earners. So here it's the top 10%. You can look at the top 1%. That's Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez's work that coined that term, 99%, 1%, was that basically if you look at this same trend, so the blue line is looking at the percent of total income that goes to the top 10% of earners. It was quite high in the 20s. It decreased dramatically after, during and after World War II, and then it's been no surprise since Reagan took office on a steady increase. The same thing holds, you can see the Gini tracks exactly the same way. There's slight discrepancies in the things that these two things are measuring, so they don't line up exactly, but this is the general pattern. I should also note, if you start looking at smaller and smaller cuts, like the more and more elite, so the top 1%, the top 0.01%, the top 0.001%, you see the same pattern. That the income shares have been disproportionately going to the highest earners, right? So they're holding large swaths of national income. So again, what this is saying, the way to interpret it is the richest 10% have 50% of the income in the United States, right? Again, I said an important measure is also wealth inequality. Wealth is a little harder to get at. Oh, sorry, yep. Yes. Explain the family line. Oh, I don't know why that's there. In the place that I got this from, I just grabbed this from online, and I actually, for all of these, had a source at the bottom, but I don't see what it is. But they were probably looking at some sort of thing that mattered for. I'm not totally sure what that's about. Okay, so here is wealth inequality, in addition to our earnings inequality and our disposable income inequality. So you can see that we have pretty high, by national standards or by industrialized country standards, pretty high levels of income inequality, but our wealth inequality is exorbitant. This is equivalent to, remember, that economy we looked at that had 10 people, 9 of which got 0, 1 of which got everything, right? And you can see the same thing in Sweden, which we hate to, in economics, ever have anything bad to say about the Scandinavians, but they have very high wealth inequality in Sweden, and you can see that these are the levels for Japan. They have great data, and we love data in economics, so anyone who has good data are friends. But they've also done a good job of taxing and transferring and stuff like that we hold dear. Okay, this is the distribution of household income in 2014 in the United States. So one thing that you can notice is that it has a strong leftward skew. So I want to go through some different measures. This is a little stats lesson. This is the most likely income that someone has, right? The greatest percentage of the population has this income. It's called the modal income. That modal income is $12,000 a year. These are households. This is US. You can't live on that in New York, Lord knows. I don't know how you would. But what does that refer to, 12,000, and why is there such a big peak there? Well, that's roughly a single full-time minimum wage employee. That's how much money they make, and that's why there's so many of them, right? And then you can look at the different percentiles. So this is the median income, which is that half the people are to the left of it, half the people are to the right of it. That's what the median measures. The mean, or average, sums up everybody's income and divides by the number of people. That's roughly 78,000. And as you have more and more of what's called a left-skewed distribution, you rely less and less on averages and more on medians, because you can see that what's happening with the averages, it looks like we're like Norway level rich, but we're not Norway level. I mean, we have as much income as Norway, but we don't spread it in quite the same way, right? So to take that total and divide by the number of people in the economy is a little bit misleading for what the typical person in the economy is experiencing, which for the US is something more like this. Clear? So that brings us to our last measure of income inequality, which is the standard deviation of income. So if you think of like a normal distribution, which would be something that looked a lot like this, except it was symmetric, symmetric and not skewed to the left like this, the standard deviation is the measure of how far the average person is from the mean level of income. Clear? How far the average person is from the average level of income. Here, and what's a nice quality of that when you're looking at a normal distribution, one that's symmetric, is that 68% of observations are going to fall within one standard deviation. That's actually how the standard deviation is mathematically computed. Here, we tend to use standard deviation a little bit less and rely more on things like the Gini because of this problem of it not being centered and symmetric. All of statistics, or not all, but much of statistics relies on that to extrapolate these interpretations that we give things. Okay, so now we'll finally get to the first of my bits of research on this. So the relationship between income inequality and subjective well-being. So here what I did was take, when I say I mean my co-author, John Ifter, and I, we do everything together. He and I did this paper. We're eventually going to be looking at the spread of subjective well-being itself. But first we started by looking at the relationship between the Gini of income. So here each observation is a country, and this is the Gini of income within that country, and then what the average life satisfaction in that country is. So we don't see as tight a relationship as we saw in some of the previous graphs, partially because this is a little bit of a, like, not as pretty a graph. It's what the statistical package spits out for you automatically. But this is a strong, actually, positive relationship. Strong positive relationship. It's not terribly positive, but the positive slope is statistically different from zero. And what that's saying is, what? People in countries that have more income inequality are happier than people in countries with less income inequality. So that's sort of weird, because it seems that people don't like income inequality. We're not asking people whether they like it, right? So that's not what we're getting at here. We're just seeing a correlation. If you live in a country that has higher inequality of income, the average of happiness in that country tends to be higher. So then we started looking at all sorts of different papers that had looked at exactly this relationship between income inequality and subjective well-being. And what's remarkable about them is that this line is zero, and each row is what the estimated relationship between these two measures was for that paper. And you can see that in all, it's basically a zero relationship. There's a lot that actually measure a zero relationship, and the number of papers that measure a negative relationship, like, income inequality is hurtful to subjective well-being, is equal to the number that find that it's helpful to subjective well-being, which is an interesting and surprising finding. So then we started looking more closely and doing some brainstorming of what might the relationship between income inequality and subjective well-being be mediated by. So the ways in which income inequality, you can do some brainstorming for yourself and see whether the things that you think about fall into one of these categories, but we thought basically if income inequality goes up, there are many things that are going to cause a decline in subjective well-being, but there's also some things that might create an increase in subjective well-being. So one thing that people are very, not as much in the economics literature to some extent, but more in political science and government, income inequality increasing, it deteriorates social cohesion and increases the likelihood of social conflicts, which should be subjective well-being diminishing. Concern for falling behind would increase with income inequality and be subjective well-being diminishing. If we just have straight preferences for equity, so this is what economists call inequality aversion or inequity aversion, then as inequality goes up, we would have a direct kind of hit to our subjective well-being. This is an interesting one in the literature. This is called choice set optimization or choice set increasing. So one thing you can think is as income inequality increases, you have a wider variety of consumption options or lifestyle choices, et cetera, open to you. And so that greater number of things to choose from might actually be subjective well-being improving, right? So if you live in, for example, a neighborhood that has a mix of different incomes as opposed to one that only has, one income represented, you're likely going to have a lot more of a variety of, let's say, restaurants and cafes and things like that. So maybe this is picking something like that up. Another interesting argument about the impact of income inequality on subjective well-being comes from Albert Hirschman, who is an amazing writer. I highly recommend him. He passed away a few years ago, but he wrote in the 70s, very lucid and humane development economist. And he was looking particularly at countries undergoing the process of development and said, when income inequality goes up, there are two different effects that might, in addition to these others, two different effects that might occur. One is called the tunnel effect. And the tunnel effect is basically saying that I take as a signal of my own future income the income of the people I see around me. So here, this held, or it was argued that it held very strongly in transition economies post-communism. So you saw that these countries experienced a sharp increase in income inequality, and that was simultaneous with increases in subjective well-being. The prediction, though, is that if your beliefs or your expectations don't end up cashing out, that you are now going to become much less happy. And you actually see that over time as you follow the transition economies. When they first moved to capitalism, you saw this increase in inequality and an increase in happiness. And then as that increase in inequality didn't come with an improvement in most people's lots, you saw kind of a disenchantment set in and subjective well-being levels go back down. So that's the tunnel effect. And then there's the zero-sum effect, which says if I think that other people's income going up is at my expense, meaning that the income generation process or economic development is a zero-sum game. If someone does better, it means someone else has to do worse, right? Then if I see income inequality increase, then I'm going to be upset by it. So these are the channels that we proposed. And then we did a study of the United States using the Gallup Daily Poll. So again, this is looking at 1,000. This is an interview of 1,000 people a day in the years 2010 to 2011. So we have something like 500,000 observations, right? And we're looking at the relationship between various measures of subjective well-being and then inequality that occurs at different regional levels. So we were looking at inequality at the zip code level. This was like the smallest level anybody had ever studied because we don't have data on that for the most part. Gallup has really refined data, so you're able to get at the zip code level. Zip codes have on average about 7,000 people in them. Holding constant MSA level, this is metropolitan statistical areas. These are about 1 million people each, you can think of as a city, versus state inequality. And what we saw, was that across these measures of happiness, so one is that best possible life, Cantrell's ladder. Another is whether you had feelings of enjoyment in the last week. Another is whether you felt happy in the last week. Zip code inequality going up has a strong, stars mean strong, positive impact on subjective well-being, or correlation with subjective well-being. MSA and state inequality, income inequality levels, have a strong negative impact. So then when you look at the net relationship comes out to be 0 in the case of best possible life, and it comes out to be negative for enjoyment and happiness. Then interestingly, if you look at these two other measures, stress and worry, to what extent did you feel stressed in the last week, to what extent did you feel worried, you see that across the board, income inequality is increasing feelings of stress and increasing feelings of worry. So again, the important thing to take away from this is it matters a lot what measure you're looking at, right? And it matters a lot what regional scale you're looking at, or who your reference group is. This is impossible to see, but you can trust me when I summarize it for you. So what we're doing here is we're taking that same analysis and we're doing it for different subgroups of the population. And we found that there were some really interesting differences between the relationship between subjective well-being and income inequality for different subgroups of the population. The first of these is that if you divide the data into those people who were in the poorest zip codes on the left and those who are in the richest zip codes on the right, you can see that, or maybe I'll just tell you, on the right, there was a much more negative relationship between subjective well-being and city-level inequality. There's almost no relationship, no statistically significant one, for people who are in the poorest zip codes. So interestingly, it's the richest zip codes who are most upset by income inequality, and the poorest ones are not. And this is something we'll see more and more, and it merits explanation. There's not an obvious story as to why that's the case, and further research definitely needs to be done to try to figure this out. Another thing that we see, the same pattern holds when we're looking at the poorest and richest cities. The poorest and richest cities, the poor ones almost the carrots just mean that there's a difference between the two boxes that I'm showing, but there's no stars. Or at least there's only one little star as opposed to 4 on each one. Meaning that these people that live in the poorest cities have basically no relationship between their subjective well-being and income inequality, while the people in the richest cities have a strong negative relationship. And that holds out also for the net effects being much more strongly negative for the richer cities. If you look at rich people as opposed to poor people, so the top two we're looking at people who live in rich versus poor regions. Now we're looking at people whose own income is in the bottom quartile, the bottom 25%, and comparing to the people who are in the richest 25%. And again, interestingly, you see, maybe this isn't as surprising, zip code level inequality is strongly subjective well-being improving for the rich people, right? Not so much for the poorer people. And then here we do a racial disaggregation, and we have whites on the left, blacks on the right, and you can see there's a lot of stars and whatnot going on the left, and not as many on the right, almost none on the right. And basically what this is saying is that overall pattern that we saw of zip code level inequality being SWB improving, city and state level being SWB diminishing is a white story. There's not much of a relationship for black people. Now this might be because there's, who knows? All sorts of different explanations can come into play. We have no real data on what that is, but it might be that these are people who've sort of inoculated themselves from worrying about the overall distribution and are instead worrying about maybe how they compare to the people directly around them or of the same race or whatever that might be. We can't say. But whatever it is, the whole story that we have is driven by whites and not blacks. Okay. how am I doing on time? Am I done? Oh no. Wait, can I just show one last set of things? I think this is cool. Okay. So this is on, now instead of looking at income inequality, we're going to now look at, here. Income and subjective well-being inequality. So this is how spread out is the distribution of happiness itself, okay? So what we're going to find is something that we call like an augmented Easterlin paradox. That's another set of researchers who worked on the same question gave it that terminology, which I quite like. But basically what happened is John and I were looking through this data, and we saw if you compare 1972 in the United States in that very simple GSS question that's just like, are you not too happy, pretty happy, very happy? It's a little hard to see, but people are moving towards the middle, right? It used to be in 1972, 30% of people said they were not too happy. Now it's 28. It used to be that 17% of people said they were very happy. Now it's only 16. These aren't big differences. But once we looked across other countries as well, and using different measures like the US distribution where you have the World Values Survey question where you have a greater possible number of happinesses that you can report, we see that same pattern, and we see it across a lot of countries, which is that the subjective well-being distribution is compressing. Is that clear to everybody? So people are less likely to report the lowest levels of happiness and less likely to report the highest levels of happiness. So here is a scatter plot of the relationship between average life satisfaction on the x-axis and the standard deviation of life satisfaction on the vertical axis. So what you can see is as countries are on average happier, the spread of their happiness distribution is becoming tighter and tighter. It's decreasing. And we see the same kind of relationship if we're looking at per capita GDP on the x-axis and the spread of happiness, the standard deviation of life satisfaction on the y, as countries are getting, or if we look at countries that are richer as opposed to ones that are poorer, the richer ones tend to have a tighter distribution of happiness than do the poorer ones. And if you look more closely at it, again, like I said before, it's because there's less of a likelihood to report the lowest levels, but also less of a likelihood to report the highest levels. So you can, if you look more closely into that, potentially find more support for those stories like the people at the top of the income distribution maybe are thinking of inequality in a different way, or their lifestyles are somehow making it so that they are less likely to report that they're very happy. Here, we're looking at countries that we have 5 data points for, at least, over the World Values Survey from 1981 to 2009. And on the x-axis, I now have the rate of change of per capita income. So no longer just the level, but how much it has changed, right? How much it has increased. And here we have the change in the standard deviation of life satisfaction. So the way to interpret this kind of like pretty strong, Finland's an outlier, but strong downward slope, is that as countries grow, the countries that grow more quickly are the ones that experience more of a convergence in their happiness distribution or subjective well-being distribution. If we include countries that if we have 4 of the 5 surveys for, we see an even more pronounced relationship. And this has been shown to hold for a whole slew of countries. Now here, it's holding for countries whose economy, no, sorry, this is now looking at something else. This is now looking over time. And we're looking only at economies that got richer, okay? So their economies grew. For the economies that grew, again, except for Finland, someone needs to do a case study on Finland, there's a compression of happiness. For the countries that saw their economies shrink, we see that in that same period of time, the spread of happiness got wider, right? And what's fascinating about this and why it merits this term augmented Easterlin paradox is that this is happening at the same time as income inequality is increasing dramatically, right? So if we're looking at, for example, here we have Great Britain. Great Britain's income inequality is increasing, and we have a sharp decrease in the spread of happiness. Same thing holds for West Germany and Australia. And interestingly, for the United States, we have that our spread of happiness has more of this U shape, right? But it's it's sort of a fascinating thing that as countries are getting richer, in other words, this augmented Easterlin paradox, as countries are getting richer, we have a compression of the subjective well-being distribution, and this is, again, despite associated increases in income inequality, right? We're like halfway through my presentation, but I'll stop there because at least this is a good clearing point. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So this is the part where we open up for questions from the general audience. And we have a bit of time to do that. So any questions,
There's one at the back over there.
Okay.
Can you just wait for the microphone, please?
Hi. A couple of observations. One is some of these countries, they have a very different experience. And you're seeing that with the two generations, the generation that endured World War II and the generation that expect this prosperity. So some of the country, like where I come from, they talk about the second generation, the rich second generation. And their expectation is so different, and how they look at money and wealth is very different. And the other thing, maybe it's in the other part of your presentation, is that the very wealthy, the very rich from different countries, they're not all that different.
Right.
And it's not, you're looking at country to country to country, but the difference is really with the middle class.
Yeah. So this is the diagram for that. Is that, so it's important, like, if you're talking about the richest, say 20% of the population or 10%, you're looking at this back row, right? And there are quite big differences. One of the big problems is, though, that they're now competing because of globalization and social media and whatnot. If you were competing, and this is on all sorts of fronts, if you were competing on just your national level, you're now competing at an international level. You're more subject to comparing yourself perhaps to all these other people. Like, so say you're in the highest 10% of income in China, you're much more aware now of how the top 10% of income earners in all these other countries are living, because you're kind of jetting back and forth perhaps between them. And so it opens up a whole new discussion of what are the relevant income comparisons to make. So that's to your second point. Your first point, insofar as, yes, there's definitely major differences between these countries, there's major cultural differences. Just one piece I didn't really highlight when I was showing this before is here, where we're looking across countries at the relationship between GDP per capita and the average level of happiness, you see these major differences for different regions of the world. Like, you have this clustering here of Latin American countries, right? These green dots are from the Americas, which, other than US and Canada, are Latin American. And you can see that they're kind of like, if you were to put a line through this, they're happier than we would predict, right? So we would say that that's something maybe cultural in their relationship with income. Their determinants of happiness are not as relegated to income as maybe some other countries. Like the countries that you see below this, it's hard to see here because the Eastern European countries are small and they're being coded the same color as Western European countries, but they're countries that, given their income levels, are much unhappier than we would predict. So again, there's other determinants to their happiness for sure, but when you look within any of these countries, there's still a strong positive relationship between income and subjective well-being. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, what I'm trying to say is, people talk about that generation that went through the Great Depression, that baby boom generation, even in this country, their attitude toward happiness and money is still very different.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And that's actually an interesting thing when you're looking at the relationship between happiness and age, for example. You have to, be concerned with the fact that your older people right now are part of a different cohort than the younger people. So it's hard to say whether they're happier. I mean, if you track the same people over time, there's like strong evidence with age people report higher levels of life satisfaction and happiness. But if you were to look at it in the cross-section, it would look like they're much unhappier, but that's because of these cohort differences. We're comparing apples and oranges when we're comparing the young and the old in a cross-section of time. So yeah, don't worry, we cope with that in various ways. And the other thing I should say is I've shown you everything graphically. These are all just like correlations. The real meat is in whether these hold up when you control for all sorts of other things that are different between these countries and not just their level of income. And so all the analyses I've shown you, these are ones that hold up to controls, meaning that you're trying to, there's going to be lots of things that are different between, for example, like, Costa Rica and Lesotho. So let's try to enumerate what those are and control for those. And when we're looking at the difference between their happiness and income relationship, make sure that we're not attributing to income the differences in these other aspects of their lives.
If economists can't ask people for data because they can't believe what people say, like you were saying, if you ask people what they spend money on, you said they won't admit to spending money on, let's say, alcohol and drugs rather than their kids' education. How do you compile and study accurate data?
Oh, that's the name of the game. So this is why there's a push towards more, again, like coherent, well-administered data sets. But I brought that up merely to say that for lots of different types of, say, consumption or preference measures, we're not going to rely on self-reports, right? We're going to look at the actual behavior and apply rationality to it, which we define in very specific ways, and say, well, this shows that these people. So for example, like if I were to say, do you think of peanut butter and jelly as complements or substitutes, there's going to be an argument. Some people see them as complements, you only have them together, or in most cases you have them together. Some people are going to say they're substitutes, they're things you smear on bread. So what do? We look at the data, like when people buy peanut butter, or like when there's a price increase in peanut butter, do people tend to buy more or less jelly? That's the way that we define whether they're complements or substitutes, right? We're not going to say, hey, what do you do? Does that make sense? Not even just because we don't trust people, but because it's the less, behavioral, if you want to put it that way, not in the kind of behavioral econ, but it's the less behavioral data that we have.
And two questions. One was about the tightening spread of happiness in the U.S. recently, and how do you reconcile that with deaths of despair and the whole narrative we're hearing of, parts of the country really struggling? Is that an illusion, or is that just a short-term thing?
Oh no, that's real.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to hear how time-wise it reconciles. And the second is about so the Easterlin paradox, and I guess like at the individual level, kind of the hedonic treadmill that people don't get happier, countries don't get happier, seems to make it unlikely that there's some explanation where GDP makes you happier, but then something else perfectly offsets it in every case, whether it's inequality or something else, just too coincidental to offset is perfect. Could it be a reverse causality problem where there's something else entirely that's making a country happy that also happens to make them richer, or an individual? And I don't think you mentioned this one.
Okay, I would be careful with the coincidence. So again, if I showed you this slide that looked at the relationship between income inequality and happiness that's been measured, I don't know that you should take away from this that it's zero. I think what you should take away from this is it depends, like all these papers vary on who they're.
I was referring to that canceling.
No, yeah. I know, but I'm saying like even if for anything, it's important to keep in mind that it doesn't mean that something doesn't exist. It often is that there are two competing pressures on the outcome. So sorry, I wanted to pick up on a thread that you talked about, which is, well, how do I reconcile that with the levels of debts people are going into? So this is the whole question of the importance of relative income and income comparisons. So here what you have is a chart of household debt to GDP ratio, which we see skyrocket, right? Household debt to GDP ratio is basically 100%, right? That's crazy. It's a technical term for it. And then this is the income share of the top 5%. So why are these things so closely tracking each other? Well, with the exception of this little burp here where there is a lag effect on the debt. Well, one argument that's brought up is that while we don't have trickle-down economics in the sense that if you give tax relief to the top income earners, that's going to translate into jobs for everyone else, there is an argument for there being a sort of top-down consumption norm set. So when you do see income in the very top of the distribution increasing, what you have happen is that people are comparing, this is what's called the relative income hypothesis, people are comparing their consumption in this asymmetric way to the people around them. They're comparing it exclusively to the people who are right above them on the income distribution, right? So if you keep the income distribution the same and you just start adding income at the very, very top, it tends to have this trickle-down effect on the consumption patterns of everybody else. The people right below them now are like, oh wait, I apparently need 10 jets in order to have made it. And then the people right below them are like, oh, well, I guess I'll get 8 jets. And whatever it is, that's going to now trickle down. And of course, like credit card companies, et cetera, bank on this and feed our habit so that we can actually express the levels of consumption that we want without having to have the income to back it up necessarily, right? So you see this relationship. This is the basis of the argument by Bob Frank in what I think is, again, an amazing book for non-economists to read. He's a great writer for non-economists, The Darwin Economy, where he's basically setting up everything as a relative story in positional arms races. So positional arms races like the US and USSR, it doesn't matter exactly how many arms or weapons or nuclear warheads you have. What's important is that you have more than your competitor, more than the other person. So what do you see happen? You see people invest in, or you saw these countries invest in their militaries, right? But we ended up constantly, at about like 50% US, 50% USSR. And the way that we won that at the end of the day was to outspend them, right? Now, we see that same thing happening with like advertisements for cigarette companies. Cigarette companies, when they couldn't advertise anymore, they saw their profits go up. That seems crazy. If their profits could go up by not advertising, then why were they advertising to begin with? These are smart people that work at these places, right? But what the rationale behind it was that there's a competitive a positional arms race. The market for cigarettes is fairly fixed. You're advertising not to get people to smoke, but to divide the pre-existing market between yourself and your competitor. So now, if nobody can advertise, you don't have to engage in that whole level of competition, right? So the more things you see that way, right, that like if relative is what matters, then we're going to make all these investments. Everyone has the incentive to try to outpace the other one. You end up with the same distribution, except you exerted a lot of, you underwent a lot of costs in order to get there, right? And so that's basically the reason it's called Darwin economy is because you see the same thing happening in nature all the time. Peacock tail, elk horns being as big as they are, these are great for getting a mate. It's very rational at the individual level, right? But at the species level, if you were to go ahead and cut all peacocks' tails in half, they would be much better off, right, at escaping prey, et cetera. They'd have the same relative distribution, but they'd be able to escape predators, et cetera, with much more ease, right? So the extent to which you take a relative story of income and all sorts of other things that we care about, the more this type of argumentation should come into play, and it really throws a lot of neoclassical economics into question, basically the policy predictions. I know I just went on a tangent, but I hope that kind of answered. Okay.
One was the debt, so that was a very interesting response. Thank you. But the other one that was playing around in the back of my mind is about this conversion of people's subjective interpretation of their own happiness was the effect of media and the entertainment industry as it's globalizing and entering into all small communities all over the world through different kinds of technical vehicles. If that hasn't created a change in subjective understanding.
Yeah, I actually, there's very, very recent research on this, but it's a totally new area of research. I'm trying to think what the takeaway from it was. Social media consumption does make one more relatively, I mean, in experimental data, it definitely makes people more relatively concerned than they might otherwise be, but I don't know the overall, I mean, this is one of the kind of, I think, most important areas of research in thinking about a lot of the things that are changing very rapidly around us and how those are going to impact us. We can't look to the past data sets in order to figure out what the effect is going to be. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that offhand. But it's definitely something people are concerned about and trying to figure out the relationships of.
This is a general behavioral economics question, and I was curious about when you were talking about, sorry, I'm hearing myself talk with the echo or whatever, so it's messing me up. But, sorry. So the idea, is there like an orthodoxy surrounding how behavioral economics like understands human nature? You're talking about the sort of breakdown of how we like enlighten self-interest, maybe a little bit of, you know, altruism, and because when you're taking these data sets, you're having to essentially create some sort of narrative out of them or like interpret them in some way. So I'm wondering what the kind of
behavioral econ take on that is. Yeah, so behavioral econ, it came about as like a critique of the assumptions of the neoclassical economics model. So it doesn't, it didn't start out with a coherent kind of vision of what we should care about when looking at economic data. It was more trying to critique what was already out there and show its limits. And the way that it was doing that was to point out the behavioral biases that people have and the systematic ones that people have. So for example, like in traditional economics, a gain of $1 would feel as good to me as a loss of $1 would hurt. Numerous behavioral economics studies have shown that we are what's called loss averse. The loss of $1 is consistently, and not just money, all sorts of things, 2 times as painful as the gain of it makes us feel better. And that's not just with subjective well-being data. No one's really done a great deal with that with subjective well-being data. This is with revealed preference data. So what do we take away from that? It wasn't as clear when it first was found, but a lot of what behavioral econ kind of veered towards was to say, compared to the rational model of neoclassical economics, like Homo economicus, the normal human beings have limits to their rationality, right? Or limits to, they have what's called bounded rationality. Where did those bounds come from? Some of them might come from social norms, et cetera. But a lot of them might have come from the, years and years our species spent as hunter-gatherers under states of self-sufficiency, as opposed to the regime we now live under, which is surplus. We didn't have surplus in most of human evolution. So not knowing exactly, like trying to figure out what the limits to our cognition, our perception, our tastes, et cetera, are that were determined perhaps in that evolutionary environment is guiding some economists, some behavioral economist research. For others, it might be that the whole model of utility maximization, that people are these optimizers, is complete crap, and really what people do is just follow basic heuristics, right? And those heuristics are determined by social norms, et cetera. There isn't a totally, there are divisions within behavioral economics, but the basic gist is one of those two kind of threads.
Since we didn't get quite all the way through, I noticed that you have several slides with books, and I was trying to write that down. Do you have some book recommendations that we didn't get to through the second half? Or just off the top of your head?
The Albert Hirschman one that I recommend is Exit voice and loyalty. It's a great one. For behavioral economics, there's predictably irrational, which is Dan Ariely's book. Predictably irrational, yeah. So Daniel Kahneman has done a lot of happiness research. Nobel Prize winner. His Thinking Fast and Slow, I've heard is good. I didn't read it because I've read everything he's written, so I didn't want to. Didn't want to do that again. And I already follow his work very closely, but it's supposed to be a pretty good read. I'm trying to think. I'll let it stew a little and let you know more, and maybe tell Leslie and Omar if something comes to mind after.
Okay, maybe this is our last.
Oh, I thought of one. Sorry. The War of the Sexes by Paul Seabright, and The Company of Strangers by Paul Seabright, which is, Company of Strangers is about how our evolutionary past shaped our attitudes towards trade and all sorts of different economic variables of interest. And then War of the Sexes is the same thing, except having to do with gender differences and gender interactions. Yep.
Okay, this will be our last question.
So I'm just curious, do we have any explanation for the U-shaped growth of America?
The U-shaped
growth for happiness, the last one you showed?
Yeah, so for this is, the U-shape, to be clear, is on the spread of happiness, the standard deviation of happiness. So basically what it's saying is from 1970 to 1990, there was a compression, and now this has taken off. One automatic interpretation might be that because we have growing income inequality, for some reason in the United States, the people who have high levels of income, their increases in happiness are sort of outweighing any increases in happiness that are happening at the bottom of the distribution, and so it's pulling the distribution farther apart. That might be one. But no, we don't have any specific one. So another important thing to keep in mind with all of this stuff is that what money buys you in a lot of these different countries is quite different. As if you have a lot of taxation and transfers, then your income is probably not going to be as important to you, to your subjective well-being, as if you live in a country that has a lot of securities and is going to, in some sense, take care of you regardless of your income. And so another explanation might be that as we move towards deregulation and as we have, a less progressive tax and transfer system than we had in the past, that we might be seeing this upswing in the spread of happiness. Yep.
Please join us in thanking Homa Zarghamee for her lecture.